Right now, like at this exact second, while you were listening to this, your mind is running this ancient operating system. And the crazy thing is, um, you never actually installed it.
No, nobody does.
Right. And the thoughts bouncing around your head, the boundaries you feel in your daily life, the limits of what you believe is even possible, all of these are largely dictated by these unseen, unquestioned forces. It's like an invisible cage.
It really is a profoundly invisible cage.
Yeah, because you wake up, you go to work, you interact with your family, and you probably feel like you're making conscious, independent choices all day. But the premise we're diving into today suggests that most of us are essentially just running on a pre-programmed script.
A very, very old script.
Exactly. And the wildest part of this whole proposition to me is that these boundaries, they actually feel like freedom to us, mostly just because we've never known anything else.
Right. The tragedy, or, well, maybe just the reality of it, is that most people are going to live their entire lives on a single, super rudimentary level of this map.
Which is what we're looking at today, the evolutionary map of human consciousness.
Exactly. And people on this base level, they completely mistake a tiny, heavily restricted fraction of human experience for the absolute totality of existence.
They think it's the whole universe.
Yeah, they do. So they cycle through the same emotional patterns. They repeat identical relationship dynamics just with different faces, and they sit around wondering why lasting change feels impossible.
Like it's a personal failure or something.
Exactly. They view it as a lack of willpower or, a psychological defect. But the source material we are deep diving into today frames this entirely differently. It is not a personal failing. It's a strict biological and evolutionary reality.
Which completely reframes the whole concept of self-improvement for you. I mean, if we were talking about an evolutionary reality, then we're dealing with something deeply structural.
Completely structural.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to explore these 6 distinct stages of human consciousness. We want to really map this territory out so you can figure out exactly where you are on this spectrum.
And to see what's possible, right?
Yes, to look at what lies just beyond your current mental horizon. But I want to push back on this right out of the gate.
Go for it.
Because when we start talking about, stages of consciousness, it can immediately sound like abstract philosophy or some kind of new age mysticism. And we're just talking about theoretical thought experiments here.
Not at all. And that's a really crucial distinction we need to make immediately. We are not dealing in metaphors today.
Okay, good.
We're talking about the neurological realities of why we feel stuck and how we actually fundamentally evolve. This is grounded in brain structures, in survival mechanics, the autonomic nervous system.
Real biology.
Real, tangible physiological shifts in how the human organism actually perceives reality. When consciousness shifts from one stage to another, it's not just a mood swing or a change in attitude.
Right.
It is a profound reorganization of how your brain processes data.
Okay, so let's ground this right in the biology then. Because human consciousness obviously didn't start with like meditation retreats or guys in togas having philosophical debates in ancient Greece.
No, it definitely did not.
It started with a biological imperative.
Yeah.
It started with a rumbling stomach, cold of night, and just this desperate need to survive until the sun came up.
Yeah.
So this is the foundation of our map. Stage 1, survival consciousness.
The basement.
The basement, exactly.
Yeah.
But, assuming you listening already understand the basic premise of the fight or flight response, I want to dig a bit deeper into the actual mechanics here.
Sure.
We all know we have this ancient reptilian brain. But how is it that an operating system that is older than agriculture, older than language itself, is literally still dictating my reactions to an email from my boss?
Well, to understand why it's so persistent, we really have to look at the massive discrepancy between evolutionary time and cultural time.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, biologically, we are essentially the exact same organisms that wandered the Pleistocene epoch hundreds of thousands of years ago. The hardware underneath your cortex, specifically the brainstem, which handles all your autonomic functions, and the limbic system.
The amygdala, right?
Yes, particularly the amygdala. It has barely changed at all. Its singular, uncompromising mandate is physical survival. Full stop.
Just keep the body alive.
Exactly. And in the harsh environment of our ancestors, the cost of a false negative was death.
A false negative meaning?
Meaning, assuming a rustling bush was just the wind, when it was actually a predator, you die. But the cost of a false positive running away from the wind, well, that's just a few wasted calories.
Oh, wow. So we basically evolved to be descendants of the hyper-paranoid.
Yeah.
Like, the optimist just got eaten.
Precisely. Evolution heavily, heavily favors the overtuned threat detection heuristic. The motto wired into our deepest circuitry is literally react first, process later.
Which is terrifying, but it makes sense.
Right, because the thalamus routes sensory information directly to the amygdala milliseconds before it ever reaches the prefrontal cortex.
Before you can even think about it.
Exactly. Conscious evaluation comes second.
Okay, and that makes perfect sense for a world defined by physical predators and, caloric scarcity. But here is where I always struggle with the application to modern life.
The mismatch.
The total mismatch. The environment has completely changed. I am sitting here in a climate-controlled room. I have a refrigerator full of thousands of calories. There are zero immediate physical threats to my existence right now. So why hasn't the brain updated its threat assessment protocols?
Because the deepest structures of the brain do not distinguish between a physical threat to your life and a psychological threat to your conceptual identity or your resources.
It treats them exactly the same.
Yes. Your brain does not know the ancient world is gone. And we've built these modern socioeconomic structures that systematically and honestly, sometimes intentionally weaponize this archaic machinery.
Wait, explain that part.
Yeah.
How is the modern world weaponizing my amygdala?
Think about the concept of precarity in modern society. When you check a dwindling bank account or you're facing potential layoffs at your company.
Right. Highly stressful.
Very. Now, your rational brain knows you're not going to instantly drop dead right there. But your limbic system, it interprets the loss of financial resources as a direct, literal threat to your ability to secure food and shelter.
So it thinks winter's coming and I'm going to starve.
Yes. The physiological response is identical to facing an evolutionary bottleneck. The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, it just floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline.
Oh, man.
Blood pressure spikes, your pupils dilate, your digestive system literally shuts down to redirect blood to your extremities. You are having a profound systemic biological emergency response.
While just sitting perfectly still on a comfortable sofa looking at a phone screen. It's a complete modern mismatch. We have all this incredibly dense, complex social infrastructure, but we are navigating it with a biological toolkit designed for the savannah.
It's absurd when you really look at it.
I mean, look at traffic. You're enclosed in a 2-ton metal box, perfectly safe from the elements, listening to a deep dive like this one, and someone abruptly cuts you off.
Oh, the road rage.
The sheer rage that bubbles up, that gripping of the steering wheel, the shallow breathing, it's utterly disproportionate to the actual event. The other driver didn't threaten your life. They inconvenienced you by, 3 seconds?
Right, right. But the nervous system reads it as a territorial violation.
Yes.
And this brings us to one of the most critical neurological realities of survival consciousness. It's what the source material calls the biological intelligence drop.
Okay, unpack that. Intelligence drop.
Yeah. When the amygdala detects a threat and initiates this whole cascade we just talked about, it actively suppresses the neural pathways to the prefrontal cortex.
Which is the smart part of the brain.
Right. It's the seat of executive function. It's where you access complex problem-solving, long-term planning, nuance, empathy.
It's all the good stuff.
Exactly. But in an acute survival scenario, nature decided that nuance was a fatal liability. You don't need to empathize with a tiger. You need to neutralize it or run away.
So, biologically speaking, we literally become less intelligent when we operate from this state.
Absolutely. We lose access to our highest cognitive capacities. You become highly efficient at a very narrow set of reactions, but your general intelligence, your capacity for wisdom and perspective is profoundly diminished.
Wow.
You simply cannot access higher order thinking when your neurobiology is convinced that you are fundamentally unsafe.
That explains an enormous amount of human behavior.
Isn't it?
Especially in high-stress corporate environments or modern political discourse. But here is what I find truly terrifying about this basement level of consciousness.
What's that?
It doesn't actually feel like a panic attack most of the time. It feels entirely normal. It feels justified.
Yes, the rationalization.
Right. When you are in it, your rational brain, even though it's technically suppressed, it still acts like this PR firm for your primal urges. It creates these highly elaborate, intellectual-sounding excuses for why you're hoarding wealth or why you're acting ruthlessly toward a coworker.
Because the mind desperately wants to maintain a cohesive narrative. It cannot accept that it's just blindly reacting to neurochemical impulses.
That would hurt the ego too much.
Exactly. So it rationalizes. It builds entire philosophies around accumulation, dominance, and, zero-sum competition. The individual actually begins to believe that aggressive territorial defense and hoarding resources is just good
Or
business.
just being realistic.
Right. But beneath all those polished justifications, it is merely the primitive brain frantically trying to build a fortress so it doesn't die.
That is just a staggering way to look at a lot of what we consider success in our culture. You see individuals who have accumulated unimaginable wealth, like far more than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes.
And they're still miserable. Still obsessively checking the markets. Still ruthlessly cutting out competitors. Still operating from a profound sense of scarcity. They are literally operating from the exact same level of consciousness as a cave dweller guarding a piece of meat.
It's the exact same hardware running the show.
Living from a place of trust or cooperation seems literally dangerous to someone locked in this state.
And that is the ultimate trap of survival consciousness.
Mhm.
The tragedy isn't that we have this system. I mean, we absolutely need it to function and survive actual physical danger.
Sure, if a car's swerving at me, I want the amygdala to take the wheel.
Exactly. The tragedy is that we mistake the concrete foundation of the building for the entire skyscraper. People spend decades, their entire lives, just refining their survival strategies, optimizing their resource accumulation, and they call that the absolute pinnacle of human existence.
But let's move the evolutionary map forward. Because eventually, for a large portion of modern humanity at least, physical survival is largely secured.
Right, the baseline needs are met. The fridge is full, the doors are locked, the physical threats are minimal. But, we don't just breathe a sigh of relief and ascend to permanent enlightenment. We seem to just invent entirely new, infinitely more complex ways to be miserable.
Which necessitates the transition to the second stage of our map, emotional consciousness. Or, as the framework really aptly calls it, the Hall of Mirrors.
The Hall of Mirrors, I love that term.
It fits perfectly. When the biological organism is no longer screaming for basic caloric or physical survival, consciousness doesn't just rest, it shifts its focus to social and psychological survival.
All right.
At this stage, your feelings become the absolute uncontested lens through which reality is interpreted.
I want to dissect this carefully because it's so easy to say feelings are important, right? And we live in a culture that highly validates emotional experience.
We do.
But this map suggests that being entirely ruled by emotional consciousness is actually a massive trap.
It is a huge trap.
The illusion here is that people mistake this turbulent, reactive emotional weather for the entirety of their identity.
The real issue lies in the total lack of objectivity. In emotional consciousness, whatever you feel is perceived as absolute truth.
Right. I feel it, so it must be real.
Exactly. If you feel rejected, then the other person must be attacking you. If you feel inadequate, then the world must be an inherently unfair place designed to oppress you.
There's no space for an alternative explanation.
None. But the most insidious mechanism of this stage, and this is fascinating, is that emotional consciousness is almost never actually responding to the present moment.
Wait, hold on. How can I be having a massive emotional reaction that isn't about what is happening right in front of me?
Because the brain is an incredibly sophisticated prediction machine. It doesn't just passively receive reality, it actively constructs it based on past data.
Okay, I'm following.
So when you encounter a situation, say, a really nuanced social interaction, your brain instantly searches its entire database of past experiences to predict what's going to happen next.
Like a search engine.
Exactly. It cross-references the current sensory input with every past trauma, every perceived slight, every moment of rejection you have ever recorded.
So it's literally emotional time travel.
That's a great way to put it.
The analogy that always comes to mind for me is walking through life wearing these deeply distorted VR goggles.
Oh, yes.
And these goggles take all your unhealed past wounds and just project them like a hologram over whatever's happening right now.
That's exactly how the predictive coding works.
So let's say you receive an email from a supervisor and it just says, let's review your project strategy at 3 p.m.
Totally neutral data.
Right, just neutral text on a screen. But through those VR goggles, your brain's prediction engine kicks into overdrive. It reads the brevity of the message, cross-references it with that time a teacher humiliated you in the 3rd grade.
Mixes in the memory of a past partner who used silence as punishment.
Yes. And suddenly, your nervous system is entirely convinced you're about to be fired, publicly disgraced, and left utterly destitute. All from, let's review your project strategy.
And you are completely unaware that you're doing this. You are not reacting to the email at all. You are reacting to an amalgamation of past pain and an imagined catastrophic future.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
And again, if we root this back in evolutionary psychology, we understand exactly why social and emotional threats trigger such extreme neurobiological cascades.
Why is that?
For our ancient ancestors, being ostracized or rejected by the social group didn't just mean you had a lonely weekend. Social exile meant a total loss of shared resources, protection, and mating opportunities.
Rejection basically meant certain death.
Absolutely certain death. The mammalian brain evolved to ensure social cohesion because our physical survival directly depended on it.
Wow.
As a result, the neurological pathways that process physical pain regions like the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula,
You'd overlap.
they heavily overlap with the pathways that process social rejection. When you experience profound social exclusion, your brain is, quite literally, telling you that your physical body is being damaged.
So the pain of a broken heart, or like social humiliation,
Yeah.
it's not just a poetic metaphor.
No, it is a registered physical trauma in the brain.
That makes so much sense out of why people will go to such extraordinary self-destructive lengths just to fit in or avoid criticism.
We will do almost anything to avoid that pain.
We would literally rather adopt a completely false identity and be accepted by the tribe than stand in our authentic truth and face the terrifying prospect of being alone.
The biological wiring is literally screaming at us that isolation is fatal.
Which perfectly explains the really complex, often deeply toxic dynamics of relationships when people are at this stage of consciousness.
Oh man, relationships at this level. Let's get into it.
When two people are operating primarily from emotional consciousness, the relationship is rarely about actually seeing the other person clearly.
It's more about survival.
Yes, it becomes a deeply transactional, unconscious arrangement designed mostly to soothe mutual anxieties. The source material refers to this as the trap of therapeutic relationships. And I find this just fascinating because from the outside, it looks like love, but it's actually just mutual life support.
That's exactly what it is.
At this level, we don't view our partners as independent beings at all. We view them as instruments to manage our own unhealed neurobiology.
The unspoken contract in these relationships is fundamentally about safety and validation. It's like, I will play this role for you if you play this exact role for me.
Just tell me I'm okay.
Right. If you validate my worth, I feel safe from the evolutionary terror of exile. But the moment you criticize me or you change or you fail to meet my emotional demands,
You become a threat.
you are no longer just a disappointing partner. You are an existential threat to my psychological survival. It is an incredibly fragile way to exist.
Because it demands that the external world constantly regulate your internal state.
Mm.
And the external world is never going to cooperate 100% of the time.
No.
And we collectively normalize this. We look at this constant background anxiety, this desperate chasing of external validation, this dramatic cycle of emotional highs and crashing lows.
And we write pop songs about it.
We write songs, we make movies about it, and we literally call it the standard human experience. We think our reactions are actually conscious choices. We think, oh, I am choosing to argue about this, or I am choosing to be upset. But we aren't choosing anything. We are just executing ancient background scripts.
And the hard truth is, you cannot simply feel your way out of emotional consciousness.
Because the feelings are the trap.
Exactly. The emotions themselves are the artifacts of the programming. You can't use the distorted lens to clearly analyze the distortion itself.
So what happens? You just get stuck there forever.
Many do. But eventually, this biological and psychological cul-de-sac forces a developmental leap. Humanity as a whole and the individual had to develop an entirely new cognitive capacity to cut through this dense, reactive fog of emotional subjectivity.
Which brings us to the great leap forward, the third stage on our map,
Rational consciousness.
rational consciousness. The source material calls this the beautiful prison. This is where the mind suddenly gains the capacity to actually step back. It introduces a pause, a literal gap between stimulus and response.
That's a game changer.
Raw, chaotic, limbic reaction is finally overridden by cold, clear, prefrontal logic. This is the cognitive revolution. This is the stage where humanity develops the scientific method, we decode the human genome, we engineer space telescopes, and we build complex legal systems.
It's monumental.
Waking up to rational consciousness for the first time must feel like suddenly turning on the floodlights in a dark, terrifying room.
It is a staggering developmental milestone because for the first time in the evolutionary map, consciousness is no longer merely experiencing the environment, it is actively objectifying and explaining it.
Subject versus object.
Yes. The profound shift here is the crystallization of the I. Abstract thought allows the brain to create highly distinct, rigid boundaries. There is now a definitive separation between the internal subject, the self, and the external object, the world.
And so your identity completely shifts its foundation. You are no longer solely defined by your biological survival, like in stage 1.
Right.
And you aren't solely defined by your tribe's emotional acceptance of you, like in stage 2. Your identity anchors itself in intellectual pride.
Your thoughts become who you are.
Exactly. It becomes about your conceptual frameworks, your academic degrees, your professional titles, the ideological belief systems you construct. As Descartes so famously articulated, establishing the absolute bedrock of rational consciousness. I think, therefore I am.
You exist because you can conceptualize your own existence.
Right. And that framework is responsible for the modern world. It allows us to manipulate our environment with unprecedented precision. However, and this is a big however,
There's always a trap.
there's an inherent, deeply seductive trap here. Intoxicated by its phenomenal success in manipulating the material world, the rational mind begins to believe it is the ultimate, final pinnacle of human evolution.
It gets arrogant.
It sells us the illusion that logic is absolute freedom. It whispers this promise that if you just analyze a problem deeply enough, if you accumulate enough data points, if you optimize your systems perfectly, you will eventually calculate your way to lasting peace.
But I have to challenge this premise, just playing devil's advocate here.
Let's hear it.
I hear this critique of rationality often in philosophical circles, and it always strikes me as somewhat ungrateful.
Ungrateful. How so?
Well, rationality cured polio. It halved infant mortality. It created the very internet that allows you to listen to this deep dive right now. How can the very cognitive tool that liberated us from superstition and biological vulnerability be considered a trap?
That's a totally fair point. The trap is not the capacity for logic itself. The trap is the exclusive identification with it.
Oh, okay.
When rationality becomes the only acceptable modality of interacting with reality, the tool becomes the master. To understand why this leads to misery rather than peace, we have to look at the neurology of over-identification with thought.
And this brings us back to the default mode network.
Yes. The DMN, I know we touched on it briefly, but let's break this down thoroughly. What exactly is this network doing that causes so much psychological distress in highly intelligent people?
It's a huge issue.
Because the phenomenon is very real. Some of the most intellectually brilliant people I know are also the most profoundly anxious and disconnected. Why is that?
Okay, so the default mode network is a large-scale brain network primarily involving the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus.
The science terms, basically the self-referential centers.
Exactly. It is the neurological substrate of your autobiographical self. It is the me, my story, my past, my future circuit.
Right.
And it becomes highly active specifically when you are not focused on a specific external task, when you are daydreaming, when you're ruminating or worrying. Your DMN is firing intensely.
So in rational consciousness, because the mind is so highly developed, does the DMN just go into overdrive?
Yes. It becomes hypertrophic. It is hyperactive almost constantly.
So it's that voice in the head that never ever stops talking. The internal narrator that provides a 247 commentary track on your entire life.
Exactly. What began as a liberating capacity for abstract thought metastasizes into this endless, exhausting loop of rumination. The highly developed intellect turns its analytical power completely inward.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
Your thoughts begin to obsessively revolve around comparing your conceptual self to others. You constantly analyze your past decisions, you obsessively model future scenarios to mitigate risk, and you hyper-focus on how your identity is perceived by the external world.
You start thinking about how you were thinking.
Analyzing your own analyses, it's endless. The intellect, which initially freed you from the erratic storms of emotional consciousness, gradually solidifies into this heavy, isolating armor.
It literally separates you from direct experience. You stop actually living life and you start continually narrating and managing it.
And this leads to a phenomenon the source material calls spiritual materialism.
I find this concept deeply compelling. Let's talk about spiritual materialism.
Well, because the rational mind is so spectacularly good at solving objective, technical problems like, building a bridge or curing a disease, It arrogantly assumes it can use that exact same methodology to solve subjective existential mysteries.
Right. It tries to solve the problem of death, or the nature of suffering, or the pursuit of meaning by just thinking about them harder.
It tries to consume enlightenment the exact same way it consumes data.
That is the essence of spiritual materialism.
Yeah.
The rational intellect treats consciousness itself as if it were just another object to be studied, categorized, and mastered.
It views awareness as a spotlight shining out into the darkness to illuminate objects of knowledge.
And it completely fails to realize that consciousness is not the spotlight. It is the vast open space in which both the spotlight and the objects appear.
Exactly. It tries to grasp the truth as if the truth were a shiny object it could just pick up and put in its pocket.
The pursuit of meaning, or even the pursuit of spiritual growth, just becomes another metric for the ego to optimize. It's like, look at my advanced conceptual models of reality. Look at how well read I am on existential philosophy. Look at how perfectly I have deconstructed the flaws in society.
The intellect tries to bite its own teeth.
That's a perfect image. The very tool you are relying on to find freedoms from the noise of the mind, which is thought itself, becomes the architecture of your cage.
It's a beautiful, sophisticated, highly educated, elegantly reasoned cage.
But you are still trapped inside your own head.
Now, it is really crucial to note here that the evolutionary map does not suggest we should regress or discard rationality. You can't just throw away logic.
Right, you cannot transcend what you have not successfully integrated. We absolutely need the rational mind to navigate complex societies, to conduct science, to maintain ethical structures.
The error is solely in accepting rational consciousness as the final destination of human evolution.
Because if you are paying close attention to your internal state, eventually, all those brilliant answers the rational mind collects, they start to ring a bit hollow.
They really do.
They begin to feel like beautifully intricate seashells, fascinating to study, perfectly structured, but fundamentally devoid of life. They don't quench the deeper existential thirst.
Which naturally forces the next profound breaking point in the map. The intellect reaches its absolute operational limit.
You hit a wall.
You hit a wall where you realize you understand practically everything about the world, but you feel fundamentally disconnected from it.
And this ushers in the fourth stage, the bridge, heart-centered consciousness.
The bridge.
I love how the source material illustrates this transition. They use this archetype of the brilliant technologist, or like a high-level executive who has optimized every single metric of their life, achieved every rational goal society set for them, and yet they are overwhelmed by a haunting sense of emptiness.
Because that emptiness is the threshold. It's the agonizing realization that the intellect can brilliantly map the territory of reality, but it cannot make you feel at home in it.
A map of a fire will not keep you warm.
Exactly. The shift into heart-centered consciousness is the transition from mapping reality to intimately participating in it. And again, this is not merely a poetic metaphor about being a nicer person.
Right, we're back to biology.
This is a profound neurological reorganization.
I'm so glad we are grounding this biologically again. Because if my worldview is going to shift from one of isolated competitive logic to one of deep, interconnected empathy, my brain chemistry and activity have to be fundamentally changing. What exactly happens in the hardware during this stage 4 shift?
We see a remarkable reprioritization in functional brain imaging, that hyperactive, self-obsessed default mode network we talked about, the one constantly narrating the story of me versus the world.
Yeah, the endless ruminator.
Its activity significantly decreases. The rigid boundary of the conceptual self finally begins to soften. And simultaneously, we see heightened activity and connectivity in regions like the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex.
Which do what, exactly?
These are the primary hubs for empathy, interoception, which is the sensing of your internal physiological state, and emotional resonance. The brain literally rewires its default predictive models to perceive connection rather than separation as the baseline reality.
That is extraordinary. The brain actually stops aggressively generating the illusion of isolation.
Yes.
So phenomenologically, from the inside, instead of viewing the world as this chaotic collection of separate objects and competing egos that you constantly need to manage, optimize, or defend against, you begin to perceive an underlying living web of relationship.
The fundamental perception of the other completely transforms.
How so?
Other human beings cease to be abstract concepts. They aren't obstacles or utilities in your personal narrative anymore. You start to recognize them not intellectually, but viscerally, as reflections of the exact same fundamental awareness that you possess.
So empathy ceases to be a moral obligation that you have to think about or force yourself to do.
Or it just becomes a spontaneous biological reality.
Let's explore the concrete example from the source material, because I think this makes the abstract concept intensely real for people.
The boardroom example.
Yes. They describe a corporate executive, deeply entrenched in the rational competitive world, sitting in a high-stakes boardroom meeting. They are discussing aggressive market strategies, maybe layoffs or hostile takeovers.
Standard rational consciousness stuff.
Right. Normally, operating from that rational stage, this executive looks around the table and just sees pawns, allies, threats, and resources in a complex, zero-sum game of chess. But then, this heart-centered shift occurs.
And everything changes.
The competitive logic doesn't just seem wrong. It entirely dissolves. They look at their colleagues, and the illusion of the corporate competitor just vanishes. They see tired human beings carrying the exact same profound fears, the same hidden insecurities, and the same desperate desire for peace that they are.
And that perceptual shift destroys the old paradigm instantly.
It has to, right? The entire framework of winners and losers becomes completely absurd.
When you genuinely bodily feel the shared humanity of the person sitting across from you, achieving a success that explicitly requires their defeat suddenly feels incredibly hollow. It can even feel physically painful.
Decision-making paradigms undergo a radical transformation. Actions begin to stem not from calculated, isolated self-interest, but from a spontaneous, deeper sense of what serves the collective whole.
But I have to say, looking at it practically, this sounds incredibly difficult to actually integrate.
I'm trying to picture this practically too. I mean, your heart bursts open, your DMN quiets down, you feel this profound, empathetic connection to everything. But it's Monday morning. You still have to commute to an office.
It's exactly.
You have to exist in a socioeconomic system that is almost entirely structured around survival fears, scarcity mechanics, and cutthroat rational logic. The friction of awakening to this state must be absolutely excruciating.
The friction is immense. It is a known psychological crisis point in developmental frameworks. The individualistic, hyper-competitive programming of the previous stages does not miraculously disappear from the society around you just because your internal state shifted.
You become the odd one out.
You become deeply vulnerable in an environment that heavily penalizes vulnerability. Your coworkers, who are firmly entrenched in rational competitive consciousness, might interpret your new focus on collective well-being as, inefficiency or weakness or severe naivety.
Oh, he's lost his edge.
Exactly. And family members who are still locked in the transactional dynamics of emotional consciousness, they might mistake your new inner stillness and your lack of reactivity for coldness or emotional withdrawal.
The source material references a marketing director who articulates this crisis perfectly. They had built their entire career on being exceptional at the corporate game. They knew how to manipulate perceptions, position themselves strategically, ruthlessly optimize for engagement.
But once this heart-centered neurological shift happens,
Playing that old game feels like a profound betrayal of their own nervous system. You aren't just projecting empathy anymore. You literally begin to experience the suffering of others as a tangible reality within your own body. You cannot ignore systemic cruelty or relational pain anymore because the boundary separating their pain from your pain has become incredibly thin.
as the Sufi mystic Rumi wrote, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. Heart-centered consciousness is the systematic dismantling of the barriers built by the rational mind.
It shatters the isolation of the intellect and brings the organism back into a deeply felt relationship with the world.
But crucially, the map does not end here.
Right. Heart-centered consciousness is called the bridge for a very specific reason.
Because as beautiful and profound as this state is, it still relies on a subtle foundational duality.
It still relies on the existence of a separate you who is making the noble choice to empathize and connect with separate them.
There is still a bridge connecting two distinct shores. So the ultimate question becomes, what happens when the shores themselves vanish?
What happens when the final boundary completely collapses?
That transition leads us into deeply radical territory. Section 5 of the map, the ocean, cosmic consciousness.
This is the stage where we really have to challenge the most fundamental, unquestioned assumptions we hold about the nature of reality and our actual place within it.
At this level, the boundary between the observer and the observed doesn't just soften, it completely, unequivocally dissolves.
I want to be extremely careful with our language here because the phrase cosmic consciousness It sounds like the title of a terrible 1970s sci-fi novel.
It really does.
We need to be crystal clear for you listening. This is not an intellectual concept. You are not sitting on a meditation cushion thinking, physics tells us everything is made of quantum fields and stardust, therefore we are all metaphorically connected. That is still just the rational mind categorizing data.
Right. Cosmic consciousness is a direct, visceral, unfiltered, experiential reality.
Okay, so to remove the mystical stigma from this, let's look at the science. We can examine the extensive clinical research conducted over the last 2 decades at major research institutions.
Studies investigating mystical states, which are often facilitated by high doses of psychedelics or recorded in advanced contemplative practitioners, reveal incredibly consistent phenomenological reports across vastly different cultures and belief systems.
The data points to a reproducible neurobiological event.
The total dissolution of ego boundaries, the brain's predictive coding models, which actively construct the perception of a separate self to navigate the environment, they temporarily shut down.
And when this filtering mechanism drops, the world ceases to be perceived as a collection of fragmented, separate objects. It reveals itself as a single, indivisible, unified field of happening.
The analogy from the source material is honestly the best I've ever heard for this.
Let's hear it.
In heart-centered consciousness, you are standing on the shore, looking out at the waves, and you have the profound realization that all the different waves are made of the exact same water. You feel deeply connected to the water.
But in cosmic consciousness,
You are no longer on the shore. The you that was watching the waves entirely vanishes. You are the ocean,
neurologically, this is the default mode network going almost entirely offline.
completely dark.
The brain's capacity to maintain the autobiographical narrative to assert, I am in here and the world is out there, is suspended. Without that constant heavy filtering, a much more fundamental primary level of awareness just floods the entire system.
I am trying to conceptualize what this actually feels like from the inside, even though language is inherently dualistic and kind of breaks down here.
It's notoriously hard to describe. But in cosmic consciousness, the subjective experience of space and time entirely loses its normal architecture. Time stops feeling like a linear progression from past to future. It dissolves into an infinitely deep, eternal present moment.
And space loses its meaning because there is no localized point of observation to measure distance from.
Exactly. The tree outside your window isn't an object located out there at a distance. The tree, the light hitting it, the sound of the wind, and your very thoughts about the tree are all recognized as occurring in the exact same intimate field of awareness.
Your thoughts aren't localized in your head, and the world isn't localized outside. Everything is just arising in this vast open space of consciousness.
The entire universe feels vibrantly alive, imbued with a profound intrinsic intelligence.
The profound realization is that the duality of the observer and the observed was an optical illusion created by the brain's survival hardware.
You do not experience a deep connection to the universe. The universe experiences itself through a localized point of biology that you used to call me.
It sounds like the ultimate liberation.
It does, but the source material highlights a massive, incredibly common danger here, a trap that is arguably more insidious than any of the previous stages.
It is a critical psychological reality. These profound cosmic experiences, whether triggered by intense meditation, breathwork, psychedelics, or spontaneous neurological events, they are almost invariably temporary glimpses.
Temporary. They don't last.
No. The human organism has an evolutionary baseline it must return to for practical thermodynamic reasons. You cannot permanently maintain a state of total boundary dissolution because an organism without boundaries cannot successfully acquire calories, avoid oncoming traffic, or maintain biological homeostasis.
The brain literally has to turn the filters back on to survive the physical dimension.
And this inevitable return to baseline leads to what clinical researchers call integration syndrome, or the trap of spiritual bypassing.
I've seen this happen, and it's fascinating in a really dark way.
It's very common.
Someone has this massive, reality-shattering glimpse of cosmic unity. The ego dissolves. They experience the absolute perfection of the infinite present. And then, an hour later, the neurochemistry normalizes. The retreat ends. They have to go back to their messy apartment, open their mail, and pay their property taxes.
And rather than integrating that profound realization of unity into the challenging, mundane reality of human life, the ego hijacks the experience.
The rational mind returns, looks at the memory of the cosmic state, and says, Wow, look how incredibly enlightened I am for having experienced that.
The individual develops a massive, highly sophisticated spiritual ego. They mistake the temporary state experience for permanent developmental stage evolution.
They use the absolute truth of oneness to excuse relative failures in their personal lives. Oh, I don't need to apologize to you for being arrogant because ultimately the me who is arrogant and the you who is offended are just illusions in the cosmic play.
It becomes the ultimate narcissistic defense mechanism.
It really does. They believe they have completely transcended the human condition, when in reality, they are just using advanced spiritual concepts to avoid the deeply uncomfortable, messy work of shadow integration, relational conflict, and true psychological maturity.
It is the ultimate spiritual dead end, which
Mhm.
begs a profound question. If cosmic consciousness is usually a temporary state, and if it is an experience that a subtle witness is enjoying and later bragging about, what exists beyond both the experience and the experiencer?
And so we have arrived at the absolute pinnacle of the evolutionary map.
Huh.
State 6, the empty space, non-dual awareness.
This is where the final, most subtle illusion drops away completely.
Non-dual awareness is the realization that even the hidden witness, that subtle detached sense of you, who is quietly observing the thoughts or enjoying the feeling of cosmic unity, is itself a construct.
In non-dual awareness, there is seeing, but there is no separate entity doing the seeing. There is knowing, but no localized knower.
I am going to struggle with this, and I think a lot of you listening will too. I am here. I am talking to you. I'm hearing your voice. How can I not exist? What does it mean that there is seeing, but no seer?
It is vital to understand that non-dual awareness is not a state of spaced-out mystical ecstasy. What is most staggering about non-dual awareness is its radical, breathtaking ordinariness.
Ordinariness.
Yes, it is not an altered state of consciousness. It is the fundamental ground of all states of consciousness. It is what has always been here, silently functioning long before your developing brain ever learned to divide raw experience into the conceptual categories of me and not me.
It's the shock of the ordinary. The profound realization at this stage is that the separate self, this heavy, anxious, continuous identity that you have spent your entire life defending, trying to improve, taking to therapy, and worrying about, was not some core essence hiding deep inside you waiting to be transcended.
No, it wasn't.
It literally never existed in the first place.
Never. The self was merely a continuous collection of thoughts, memories, bodily sensations, and predictive models that awareness mistakenly identified as a solid entity. Think of a visual optical illusion, like those pictures where you can see either a vase or two faces.
Oh, I know those.
For your whole life, you've only seen the faces. Suddenly, your perception shifts and you see the vase. Once you clearly recognize the vase, you realize the faces were just an illusion created by the lines. You can still see the lines, but you are no longer fooled by the illusion.
So in non-dual awareness, you realize the separate self was an illusion created by the rapid succession of thoughts.
Exactly.
Okay, conceptually, I am following the analogy. But practically, this brings up the most urgent question of the entire deep dive for me.
Which is?
If this is true, how do I actually function? If the I, who's supposed to be doing the living, doesn't actually exist as a solid entity, how do I make dinner plans? How do I pay my mortgage? How can I possibly care for my children or excel at my job if there is no me at the center of the control room?
It's the ultimate paradox of functioning. The fear is that if the self vanishes, you will become catatonic or detached from life and just float away into a void of apathy. But the exact opposite occurs.
What happens?
The answer is natural participation. Life simply continues, but with infinitely less friction. Decisions are still made, actions are still taken, complex problems are solved, and emotions continue to pass through the nervous system. But they happen spontaneously without a central, anxious character needing to claim ownership of them or extract an identity from them.
So the personality doesn't disappear. Your unique quirks, your sense of humor, your preferences, they're still there.
Yes. The biological organism retains its conditioning and its flavor. All the previous stages of the map still arise. The biological survival fears, the analytical logic of the prefrontal cortex, the emotional reactions of the limbic system, they still happen.
But their relationship to awareness completely changes.
They are seen for exactly what they are. Temporary weather patterns passing through an infinitely vast open sky. They are movements of energy within awareness, but they are no longer mistaken for your fundamental identity.
So when a tight deadline approaches at work, the body might still flush with cortisol. You might feel the survival fear. But instead of the mind collapsing around that fear and declaring, I am terrified, my life is falling apart, there is just the neutral observation, Fear is arising in the body
The fear is allowed to exist, burn through the nervous system, and dissipate. It is just a weather pattern.
because there is no longer a solid, rigid center claiming the fear, feeding it with a story, and trying to fight it. It is just energy arising and passing.
Precisely. And this realization leads us directly into the ultimate untold secret of this entire evolutionary map. This is the hardest truth of our deep dive, and it fundamentally reorients the entire journey.
We're talking about section 7, the spiral path.
Yes, this is where we have to completely dismantle the most pervasive, damaging myth about consciousness and spiritual growth. The myth is that consciousness is a ladder.
We think we start at the bottom in the survival basement, and if we meditate enough, read enough, or go to enough therapy, we climb up to emotional, then rational, then heart-centered, all the way up to non-dual awareness.
And once we reach the top, we plant a flag, sit on a cloud, and remain in a state of unshakable Zen perfection for the rest of our lives.
And that is a profound delusion. You cannot stay at the top. The biology of the human organism makes it impossible. Consciousness is not a linear ladder you climb once. It is a complex, dynamic spiral that you travel continuously.
It is an endless rhythm of expanding into vast awareness and contracting back into localized biology. It is the eternal pulse of remembering your true nature and then forgetting it again.
And when people refuse to accept the reality of the spiral, they get trapped in what the source material brilliantly calls spiritual memory syndrome. Let's unpack this thoroughly because it is incredibly common.
It really is. You touch that unified state. You have the profound non-dual realization. You feel completely free. But then life happens.
A truly rude, aggressive email arrives from a colleague. You hit unexpected gridlock traffic when you are already late. You get into a deeply triggering argument with your partner about money.
And the biology takes over. The autonomic nervous system activates. The HPA axis floods your body with stress hormones. And instantly you plunge straight down the spiral right back into the basement of survival consciousness, or the reactive hall of mirrors of emotional consciousness.
The tragedy of spiritual memory syndrome is that the ego, which has strongly attached its identity to being an enlightened or highly evolved person, flatly refuses to admit it has slipped.
Right. The ego weaponizes the spiritual concepts as armor to avoid the vulnerability of being human.
You see this when someone says in a very tight, controlled voice, "Oh, I'm not angry. Anger is an illusion. I have transcended anger," while their jaw is clenched so tight it might shatter and they're radiating hostility.
They are living entirely in the memory of their past awakening while completely denying the messy, contracted reality of their present moment.
The evolved ego is actually infinitely more stubborn and difficult to dismantle than the original unexamined ego, because it has an entire vocabulary of spiritual concepts to defend its neuroses with.
Exactly. It uses the concept of the sky to deny the reality of the storm. True transcendence, the actual maturity of consciousness, is not about aggressively rejecting or escaping the lower biological levels. It is about including them.
It is developing the vast internal capacity to allow the organism to move through all of these levels, survival, emotional, rational, but learning to respond to them from a place of spacious awareness, rather than reacting blindly from a place of deeply conditioned fear.
I love the analogy we discussed earlier. It is incredibly easy to think you are a Zen master when you are sitting alone in a perfectly quiet room on a comfortable cushion with incense burning and soft music playing. The environment is doing the work for you.
But the real, uncompromising test of your evolutionary growth is when your teenager gets arrested, or when your company goes bankrupt, or when your flight is suddenly canceled, you are stranded in an airport and you are going to miss the most important meeting of your career.
That is where the rubber meets the road. That is the true measure of growth. Psychological and spiritual maturity is not measured by how high you can get on the spiral during a peak experience.
It is not measured by your ability to hold on to a fragile state of cosmic peace through sheer force of will.
True growth is measured exclusively by how quickly you return to presence after you realize you have slipped back into fear, anger, or the illusion of separation.
It's all about the recovery time, the elasticity of your awareness.
Exactly, elasticity. When you inevitably drop into the rigid, paranoid state of survival consciousness, and you will, because you are a biological organism, do you recognize the biological hijacking faster?
When you start playing manipulative power games in a relationship to soothe your emotional anxiety, do you catch the pattern sooner? Can you remember your fundamental spacious nature while you are stuck in gridlock traffic and your nervous system is screaming at you to fight or flee?
Embracing our humanity means surrendering to the reality of this spiral. It means accepting that you will cycle through the survival fears of the basement, the emotional distortions of the hall of mirrors, the arrogant logic of the beautiful prison, the opening of the heart, and the vastness of the empty space over and over and over again for as long as you are breathing.
But with every single cycle, with every rotation of that spiral, you bring a little bit more gentle awareness and a little bit less frantic fear to the profoundly human experience of forgetting who you are and then remembering again. You finally stop trying to violently transcend your messy humanity, and you start bringing the light of awareness into it.
You cease fighting the architecture of your own neurobiology. You learn to meet every single layer of your experience, the petty jealousies, the profound insights, the physical pains, the expansive joys with an unconditional, spacious presence instead of resistance.
This has been a massive paradigm-shifting journey today. Let's briefly summarize the map we've traveled. We started by examining the ancient, hypervigilant basement of survival consciousness, recognizing how modern precarity weaponizes our oldest neurobiology.
When that was biologically secure, we moved up into the emotional hall of mirrors, where our predictive coding projects passed traumas onto present realities.
From there, we explored the great leap into the beautiful, isolating prison of rational consciousness, where the default mode network traps us in endless rumination and spiritual materialism.
That crisis led us to the bridge of heart-centered consciousness, where the brain physically rewires for empathy, dissolving the logic of competition.
We then dove into the cosmic ocean, exploring the temporary, awe-inspiring dissolution of ego boundaries. And finally, we arrived at the staggeringly ordinary empty space of non-dual awareness, realizing that the separate self was an optical illusion all along.
And yet, as profound as those upper stages are, the truth of the spiral path reminds us that we are still here, grounded in biology, living deeply human lives.
Which leaves us with a final, perhaps radical thought to ponder as we close. We spend so much of our time, our money, and our life force aggressively trying to escape our lower natures. We view our fears, our biological reactions, and our emotional messiness as enemies to be conquered or transcended.
But what if the ultimate goal of human evolution isn't to permanently escape the basement of your humanity? What if the goal is to finally become the vast, loving, spacious awareness that has the capacity to embrace all of it? The primal fear, the cold logic, the profound love, the forgetting, and the remembering without ever needing to flinch or look away.
Wow. Embracing the cage with so much awareness that the bars simply dissolve. Thank you for taking this profound deep dive with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
As you move through your actual day now, as you deal with the gridlock traffic, the unread emails, the complex conversations with the people you love, try to simply observe the spiral path in real time. Notice which operating system is currently running the show. You don't have to change it, just notice it. Because the moment you truly see the ancient programming, it begins to lose its absolute power over you. Catch you next time.